At 6:03 a.m., a white SUV treated my ranch gate like a polite suggestion. The bumper eased forward until steel bent, and the new chain popped like a brittle twig. She didn't stop. She didn't even slow. Just waved at my trail camera with the sort of smile you'd give a parade float, coffee cup balanced in her other hand. 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. As HOA president, I am authorizing this as an emergency corridor. Please leave the gate unlocked. I laughed out loud, which was better than the curse I wanted to send back. My name is Mason, and my place sits on the uneasy seam where country land slams up against cookie-cutter ambition. West of the fence, 320 acres of mesquite, cattle that know my whistle, and one gravel road that dies at my barn. East of the fence, Saguaro Vista Estates, a new subdivision that looks like someone cloned beige and stamped it in rows, each house with granite counters and a sales pitch about nature-adjacent living. The property line is a clean surveyor's mark. The conflict is everything else. The road she used has always been mine. It is not a shortcut, not an easement, not a public byway dressed up as private inconvenience. I posted 3 signs on the gate because SUV drivers trust fonts more than barbed wire. Private ranch road, no trespass, dead end. The day before that text, I had replaced the chain for the 3rd time this month. Someone had been clipping it, driving through, then looping it back like a guilty necklace. The camera finally told me who. The next morning, I found her waiting at the gate. She didn't get out, just lowered her sunglasses, the kind worn by CEOs at charity golf tournaments, and smiled. "Good morning," she said, as if we were chatting about sprinklers. "We have complaints about your obstruction. I have hoof prints in my driveway where your bumper shoved my cows," I said. "What's your plan when 1,200 pounds of beef decides it prefers cul-de-sacs?" Her smile didn't flinch. "There's a historic right-of-way here. Everyone used this road before these homes existed." "Everyone," I said, "is working hard in that sentence. Show me a single document." She promised an email. Meanwhile, she explained the community needed secondary egress. Insurance rates, emergency response times, neighborhood anxiety. She said liability 3 times like she'd invented the word. Everything she argued might be true for her side of the fence, but none of it erased the fact that the road was mine. That afternoon, I called the sheriff. Out here, trespass caught in the act gets attention. Yesterday's trespass becomes a shrug. The deputy told me to keep documenting. Cameras, timestamps, clear signage. All of which I already had, plus patience, which is a rancher's quiet crop. He said, "Catch them, and we'll come if we can." The camera filled its card with a routine. 6:01, 6:02, 6:04. SUV rolling through, latch groaning, always that parade wave. Sometimes a dog in the back. Sometimes a car seat. Once a trunk full of shopping bags. On Thursday, my lens went black. I checked the feed and found a fluorescent sticker plastered over it. A neat circle with Community First printed on it. Clever, if you're in middle school. I mounted a second camera up in the ironwood and let the sticker sit proud. Then came the app posts. My one-word reply of no to her original text appeared online with my full name and the caption, "Blocking an evacuation route." Someone accused me of cosplaying cowboy to feel powerful. Another insisted my cows were aggressive. My cows are judgmental. They watch strange cars like they're watching slow television and critique them without mercy. But aggressive? Only tore grass. I tried diplomacy again. Printed the county recorder's plat showing the boundary lines and the blank space where no easement existed. I mailed copies to the HOA box and to her address with a courteous cover letter and my phone number. She responded on HOA letterhead with a compliance notice, citing bylaws about access to shared amenities. According to her, my road was now equivalent to their pool. I pinned the notice to the barn wall. The cows were unimpressed. The developer had sown this mess a year back. He'd offer me money for an easement that would connect his subdivision to the county road along my north fence. I said no. He built anyway, filing a plat with a single entrance and a vague promise of coordination with neighboring stakeholders. That phrase had matured into my buzzing phone at dawn, uninvited and unwelcome. Saturday, Orange survey flags appeared like weeds along my fence line. Two men in neon vests paced my road with a measuring wheel. When I told them to leave, they said the HOA had authorized preliminary grading for a fire access lane. I asked them which part of their bylaws let citizens rewrite county maps. They shrugged, packed slowly, and muttered about resolutions coming soon. That afternoon, a certified letter landed in my mailbox. The seal made the envelope feel heavier. The county fire marshal, nudged by a citizen complaint, had opened an investigation into whether my gate was an obstruction on a designated evacuation route. I read it twice, then again, trying to find the logic. There was no designation, no route, but fear is quick to promote rumors into law. I was angry, but anger burns out and leaves you foolish. I prefer patience, the kind that smolders. I walked the fence line and made notes. I checked the angles of my cameras. I called Tully, an old neighbor who remembers this land before subdivisions learned to name themselves. He reminded me that 30 years ago, the school bus had a handshake deal to cut through the ranch during flood days. Not recorded, not official, just memory. A seed that could grow into myth if watered by enough desperate parents. Her version of history suddenly made more sense. In her world, historic right-of-way meant decades of gossip hardened into truth. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a woman under pressure, juggling anxious neighbors and an HOA board that wanted lower premiums. She had an audience, and she had a story. Trouble was, she also had my gate swinging on her bumper. That night, I sat on the tailgate of my truck, maps spread across my lap, the desert air cooling around me. I knew better than to fight her on social media. Noise only feeds noise. I needed evidence that couldn't be waved away, something undeniable to the county and to a judge. If she insisted on breaking through, then she would help me prove it. All I had to do was make the trap subtle, clean, and perfectly legal. A trap that would not damage her car, would not hurt a soul, but would make her entitlement impossible to deny. And by moonlight, I started to sketch it out. Dawn came in thin light, and I found myself awake with the clarity of someone who decided to move pieces instead of screaming. The trap I'd sketched was less theater and more math. Sensors on the latch to log force, reflective markers for tire compression, a second camera angled to catch faces and license plates. Every element was legal, passive, and designed to generate evidence a judge couldn't shrug away. If she insisted on forcing entry, the record would be clean. She arrived on schedule, a familiar gray SUV easing up like a bureaucrat who'd mistaken boldness for duty. The bumper nudged the chain, the sensor logged a breach, and a tiny message blinked on my phone. Latch breach 604. The new camera caught her profile without glamour. In the photo, her jaw was tight, not vicious. The tension read like someone trying to contain a crowd of people she promised safety to. Entitlement had texture, responsibility wrapped in panic. She texted the HOA list within minutes. Emergency egress required. Landowner obstructing. The thread filled with worried emojis and questions about liability. I replied privately to the inspector who had promised to look, forwarding timestamps and unedited footage. He answered with terse competence and a warning I had hoped to avoid. Paperwork was often how small claims became permanent reality. When papers match expectations, people believe them. When they don't, men in suits start making choices. A week later, a county inspector showed up with a soft voice and a hard pen. He moved through my evidence like someone cataloging facts, not fanning flames. He tested magnetic seals, photographed compressed gravel patterns, and compared timestamps. He left with copies and a promise to run queries. I trusted him because government moves slowly, but usually in predictable lanes. Then the landmine revealed itself, a resolution purporting to designate my road as a secondary evacuation route. It bore county letterhead and an official signature, except the county had never issued such an order. The signature style was right, but dated months before anyone mentioned the lane, and someone had manufactured the seal with alarming precision. I'd expected force and entitlement. I hadn't expected forgery. That meant the fight had stepped sideways, from trespass to paper crime. I fed the forged document to the inspector and watched his face narrow. He told me he'd seen this before. Developers or boards manufacturing authority to grease a plan. He said they exploit fear, storms, fires, evacuations, then supply a comforting, authoritative answer. Sign here. It's cleaner than intimidation because consent masks coercion. I've been dealing with a symptom. Now, I was facing a deliberate strategy. Once an institution is impersonated, the incentives shift. The developer who tried to buy an easement months earlier surfaced in my mind, like the missing piece of a scale drawing. If the plat had been left incomplete intentionally and a manufactured resolution retroactively justified construction, the developer could claim a legal basis for cutting through my land. Neighbors would cite the stamped paper. Insurers would nod. The HOA president, who'd been pushing access as a mitigation tactic, would look like a local decision-maker trying to protect her people. She would be sympathetic in the press and in depositions. She had incentive, reputational capital, lessened premiums, and a storyline that turned inconvenience into wisdom. That nuance mattered. She wasn't a cartoon villain enraged by my cows. She was a functionary trapped between anxious homeowners and a developer who paid attention to leverage. The forgery didn't make her evil. It made the system she served exploitable. When power hides under paperwork, people who want predictable outcomes will sign whatever looks official. I'd seen that before in town politics. The person most certain they're acting for the common good will often be the first to accept a convenient lie. I started tracing patterns. The HOA minutes listed a consulting firm that had offered fire mitigation solutions pro bono. The same firm appeared in the developer's promotional materials. A local contractor who'd buried survey flags on my fence worked regularly for both. The web of convenience tightened with each call. Whoever had created the fake resolution had knowledge of county forms and access to a seal template, and likely a motive. Sell houses faster by eliminating objections and present a neat, defensible public safety argument. If you could manufacture an emergency, you could manufacture the answer. As officials dug, the community conversation shifted tone. Anonymous flyers smeared my name with reckless, and private forums debated the morality of individual property rights versus community safety. The president spoke at a town hall with a binder of copies, her voice steady. She described emergency planning and actuarial reality. People nodded because fear sells. She had witness, she had audience, and she commanded empathy. She was competent. She was also a human with a job that required solvable answers, and solvable answers are seductive. The law offered a blunt and slow blade. I filed a report for trespass and a separate complaint about suspected document forgery. The sheriff's office handled trespass quickly. Forgery required forensic steps. I briefed the inspector with precise logs and kept my public comments measured. Let the forensics do the shouting. If I made the fight a spectacle, the noisy theater would let them manufacture better lies. On the third night after the inspector left, I found a stapled flyer on my mailbox with my face and the word dangerous. Someone had photographed my property and turned the image into a threat. The flyer read like advertising copy for panic. I left it on the ground and walked the fence in the pale moon, thinking about how paper and pixels now defined what used to be a simple property line. The trap had worked technically. It had proved the forced entry. Now the work was political and surgical. Unmask the forger and show the town the difference between stamp paper and actual authority. The next twist would require patience and leverage. I began building both. More cameras, more documented visits, and quiet calls to reporters who had a taste for small-town corruption wrapped in civic drama. If the county's forensics could link the forgery to the consulting firm or the contractor, the narrative would change. People who had nodded at the binder might start asking uncomfortable questions about who funded that binder. Until that point, the forged resolution would sit like a tooth under a crown, ugly but trusted. I slept with one eye open and one hand on my phone, because the slow work of unspooling a lie is a practice start, and I intended to be an apprentice with a grudge. The morning the forensic report landed, I half-expected shrug. Instead, the inspector called with a voice edged by caffeine and vindication. The county lab had flagged the seal as a digital copy lifted from a 30-year-old plat file, one never meant to leave the archive room. The signature was a scan of a dead commissioner's handwriting. In other words, the resolution was a ghost, stitched together from pieces of history to look legitimate. It wasn't just a bad copy, it was fraud. The sheriff's office opened an investigation. That would have been enough to make a normal HOA backpedal, but the president doubled down. She sent a letter to every homeowner, claiming the forgery was my fabrication, an attempt to smear their board, destabilize community safety, and force higher premiums. The letter was slick, printed in full color, and dripped with accusation. It had the one quality dangerous lies always share. It sounded reasonable if you didn't ask questions. Most of the subdivision didn't. Within days, I was the villain in their story. Neighbors drove by slowly, some rolling down windows to shout about selfishness. A few muttered traitor, like I'd sold them to a foreign power. Someone scrawled, "Unlock the gate," on my barn in spray paint, sloppy and red. When you guard your property line long enough, people stop seeing you as a man and start seeing you as a wall. Walls invite graffiti. I could have filed another report, but paper was already my enemy. So I leaned into theater. Evidence turned into performance. I printed the forensic findings and pinned them to a plywood board at the fence line. I circled the lab's conclusion in red marker, underlined the commissioner's date of death, and added one line in my own handwriting. A ghost signed your resolution. I positioned a spotlight so the board glowed at night like a roadside shrine. The ranch road became less a shortcut and more a billboard. Subdivision traffic slowed to stare. Some took photos. My quiet protest turned into spectacle, and spectacle is contagious. The developer blinked first. He released a statement distancing himself from the HOA, insisting he knew nothing of the forgery, promising cooperation. But he also blamed me for aggressive tactics and escalating hostility. He wanted to thread the needle, deny fraud, but keep pressure on the landowner. That half measure was a mistake. It gave me a crack to widen. I reached out to a reporter I'd quietly cultivated. She'd cut her teeth covering zoning battles and school board meltdowns, and she loved a paper trail. I gave her the forensic report, my footage, and copies of the forged resolution. She asked for comment from the HOA president. Instead of declining, the president invited her to a board meeting, expecting a friendly stage. What she got was cross-examination. The reporter pressed her on the commissioner's death, on the recycled seal, on the sudden emergence of historic rights-of-way. The president stammered, citing consultants, advisors, community safety. The video went online that night. 2,000 views in the first hour, 10,000 by morning. Neighbors who had called me selfish suddenly went quiet. Some shifted in my direction, not out of apology, but out of embarrassment. People hate being conned more than they love being safe. Once they realized the forgery had been slipped into their story without consent, anger redirected. The HOA meeting the next week was chaos. Raised voices, demand for resignations, one board member storming out. The president clung to her chair with white knuckles, still insisting she had acted in good faith, still portraying herself as the victim of a smear campaign. The sheriff's investigation sharpened. They seized computers from the consulting firm, interviewed the contractor with the survey flags, and subpoenaed developer emails. The narrative shifted from trespass to conspiracy. What had started with my broken chain now carried the whiff of organized fraud. And fraud with government seals attracts prosecutors faster than cows attract flies. I stayed quiet, which infuriated them more than words. My sarcasm lived in my notes, not in public. I tended cattle, mended fences, waved at gawkers with a smile that read like mockery. Inside, though, I carried a kernel of dread. Corner people don't fold neatly. They lash out. When reputations collapse, so do inhibitions. I braced for retaliation. It arrived at midnight 2 weeks later. Headlights swept across my yard, and the crunch of tires stopped at the barn. I grabbed a flashlight and my phone. 3 masked figures leapt from a truck bed, one with a can of gasoline, another with a sledgehammer, the third with a stack of flyers. They meant to burn, break, and bury me under propaganda. My new cameras caught every angle. Motion sensors triggered floodlights, and suddenly the yard blazed like a stadium. They froze like deer, masks caught in harsh glare. The truck fishtailed in panic, one of them stumbling to keep up. They left behind a can, the hammer, and a flyer that read, "No more walls." I called the sheriff before the dust settled. Deputies arrived with sirens and evidence bags. The footage showed enough detail. Tattoos, shoes, the truck's bent fender. That identification was inevitable. When the news broke, the HOA president denied involvement, but doubts settled heavy. This was no longer a fight about a gate. This was escalation, reckless and raw, and it belonged to her camp whether she admitted it or not. The trap had started as sensors and cameras, but it had become something larger, a mirror. Every move they made, every lie they spun, every stunt they attempted reflected back sharper than before. They had mistaken stubborn patience for weakness. They were learning the hard way that patience, when paired with evidence, becomes something lethal. And the next act was coming faster than they realized. The sheriff called me 3 days after the midnight stunt. He sounded tired, the kind of tired you get from talking to people who lie with conviction. They traced the truck to a contractor on the HOA payroll. The man swore the vehicle had been stolen, but his alibi evaporated under video evidence from a gas station. Tattoos matched, gait analysis confirmed. He was cornered. Instead of taking the fall alone, he named names. The consulting firm had promised him steady work if he handled community enforcement. The phrase was chilling in its blandness. Burn barns, smash gates, plaster flyers, that was enforcement. Word traveled fast. Homeowners who had defended the president began whispering about corruption. The subdivision's online forum split into factions, one still loyal to her leadership, another demanding her resignation, and a smaller group horrified by the idea they'd been pawns in a scheme stitched together with fake seals and hired thugs. Fear curdled into resentment, resentment into anger. A board meant to regulate lawn heights was now the stage for a criminal investigation. The absurdity would have been funny if it hadn't put fire cans on my land. The next twist landed like a brick. The developer himself called me. Smooth voice, practice calm. He said he wanted to resolve matters amicably. He offered money, more than the easement deal a year back, enough to repaint the barn, buy feed for a season, even patch the roof. All I had to do was sign an agreement granting limited emergency access. The HOA would drop their campaign, the county would move on, and peace would return. He framed it like generosity, a chance for me to end the circus gracefully. I told him his circus had already burned its tent down, and I wasn't in the market for ashes. He hung up without a goodbye. That refusal set off the real storm. The HOA president filed a civil injunction against me, demanding the gate remain unlocked pending investigation. She stood before a judge with glossy charts about fire risk, evacuation modeling, and actuarial doom. Her lawyer leaned hard on fear. What if a child died because of one man's stubbornness? The courtroom murmured. For a moment, I felt the weight of the narrative shift against me. Fear sells better than truth. But then my attorney, calm, sharp, unamused, placed the forensic report on the bench, highlighted in red. He played the video of masked men sprinting across my barnyard, gasoline sloshing. He showed the plywood board with the phrase, "A ghost signed your resolution." He said one line, quiet but cutting. They forged a ghost, and when caught, they tried to burn the evidence. The judge denied the injunction without another word. That ruling cracked the dam. Local news picked up the story, not as a property dispute, but as a drama about forgery, corruption, and intimidation. The HOA president went from community protector to embattled figurehead overnight. Cameras camped outside subdivision meetings. Residents heckled her in driveways. Parents who once cheered her safety-first speeches now avoided her SUV in the carpool line. Reputation is fragile, and once it fractures, every glance feels like a hammer. But collapse doesn't make people harmless. Backed into a corner, she tried one final gambit, painting herself as the true victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by me, the county, and a vindictive press. She claimed she'd been manipulated by consultants, misled by contractors, pressured by the developer. She wasn't corrupt. She was naive, a woman tricked into playing villain in someone else's scheme. It was half confession, half absolution. Some bought it, enough to keep her afloat another week. I stayed still. I let her words float into the air and vanish under their own weight. Meanwhile, investigators pressed harder. Subpoenas pulled bank records. Contracts surfaced showing payments from the developer's LLC to the consulting firm, then routed to the contractor who lit my driveway at midnight. It wasn't sloppy accounting. It was arrogance, as if no one would bother to look. But arrogance is brittle, and once cracked, it shatters. The bigger twist came when federal agents arrived, forging county seals, orchestrating fraud across state lines with developer funds. Those weren't just local misdemeanors. The story had grown legs longer than anyone expected. The FBI opened a file. That news hit the subdivision like a thunderclap. Families who once mocked me now hustled to distance themselves from the board. Some taped handwritten apologies to my gate, awkward and stilted, as though courtesy could erase weeks of slander. I didn't respond. Courtesy is cheap when paid late. Still, I couldn't ignore the pressure in my chest. I'd built my life on calm, cattle, and fences that marked the line between mine and not mine. Now I was part of a drama sprawling far beyond my pasture. Reporters left voicemails. Activists emailed support. Neighbors whispered apologies. I kept feeding cows, fixing troughs, and watching the desert sky turn violet at dusk. But inside, I carried the sense of an ending coming fast, bigger than property lines, bigger than ranch gates. The story had grown past me, and like all things swollen with lies, it was going to burst. The finale didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived with silence, the kind that rolls over a place when people are too stunned to keep arguing. A Monday morning, the HOA president's SUV wasn't at the gate. The road lay empty, the chain untested, my phone unbuzzed. I checked the cameras, nothing but quail darting across gravel. Around noon, my attorney called. The federal indictment had dropped. Charges included conspiracy, wire fraud, document forgery, and attempted arson. The president's name was listed alongside the developer, the consulting firm's partners, and the contractor who still bore gasoline under his fingernails. They weren't neighbors anymore. They were defendants. The subdivision reacted like a hive struck with a stick. Some residents held emergency meetings. Others posted frantic apologies on the same forums where they'd once called me selfish. A few tried to claim they'd known something was off all along, rewriting their own history with the ease of people who never risked much. The HOA board disbanded within a week, replaced by a county-appointed trustee tasked with stabilizing the neighborhood until a new election. My road was no longer in their agenda. It was evidence. That should have been enough. But life doesn't clean itself up with a neat bow, and entitlement doesn't dissolve with handcuffs. One evening, just as the desert light began to bleed into copper, I saw her SUV parked at the fence. No entourage, no clipboard, no theatrics. She stepped out, dressed in ordinary jeans, her face stripped of its courtroom polish. She didn't approach the gate. She just stood there, arms crossed, watching the cattle graze. I walked down, boots crunching gravel, stopping short of the chain. "You got what you wanted," she said. Her voice wasn't sharp anymore. It was hollow, heavy with the awareness that the fight was over. "Congratulations." I studied her for a beat. This was the woman who had waved at my camera like royalty, who had argued with rehearsed authority about liability, who had plastered flyers calling me dangerous. Now she looked smaller, not cartoonish, not monstrous, just tired. A neighbor who had played a role too big for her to manage. "I never wanted this," I said. "I wanted my road back." "You could have let it go," she whispered. "It was just a gate." I almost laughed, but something in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't wrong, not in the way she meant. To her, it was just a gate. To me, it was the line between ownership and chaos, between patience and surrender. I thought about saying all that, but what came out was simpler. No, it was the truth. She nodded once, turned, and left. The SUV disappeared down the subdivision road for the last time. I didn't see her again. Rumors said she pled out, traded testimony for leniency. The developer fought longer, louder, but the paper trail strangled him. The consulting firm folded. The contractor pled guilty before trial. Justice wasn't cinematic. It was paperwork, signatures, hearings scheduled months apart. But it was steady, and it was final. Months later, life crept back toward normal. The gate swung on new hinges, the chain heavy with a lock that hadn't been tested in weeks. The cows still gathered at dusk, judgmental as ever. My cameras still blinked red, but they mostly captured sunsets and coyotes. Neighbors drove past on the county road, heads ducked low, unwilling to meet my gaze. A few brave ones waved, awkwardly. I waved back. Forgiveness is an obligation, but indifference is exhausting. I let them stew in their own time. The story, of course, refused to die quietly. The reporter turned it into a feature, framed as a parable about property rights, corruption, and one stubborn rancher who refused to yield. The headline was sharp enough to sting: "The Gate That Broke an HOA." People sent me copies in the mail, underlined passages, wrote notes about how they wished they'd stood firm in their own battles. I didn't answer. Heroes belong in stories. I belong on my land. But I did keep one trophy. In the barn, pinned above the workbench, I hung the flyer that had once called me dangerous. The red spray, paint still bled across the word like a warning. Beneath it, I taped the forensic report's final line: "Seal proven fraudulent." Together, they looked like a dialogue between lie and truth. Whenever I glanced at it, I remembered how quickly paper can turn into a weapon and how much patience it takes to turn it back into evidence. The absurdity of it all still make me shake my head. A fight that began with a bent chain ended with indictments and headlines. A neighborhood built on granite countertops nearly collapsed under forged seals and gasoline. And me? I learned that patience is sharper than rage, that sarcasm can keep you sane, and that sometimes the best trap isn't steel or wire. It's time, documentation, and the refusal to play along with someone else's fiction. The road remains mine. The gate is closed. And every morning, when the sun cracks over the mesquite and the cattle nudge each other toward water, I hear only silence where once an SUV idled. It is the most satisfying sound I know.